So just the other day I was hunting around Watkins bookshop in London. And Watkins is a great place. You can find it on Cecil Court, just around the corner from Leicester Square Tube Station. It's full of every occult book you could ever want on any subject. It's got lovely incense and crystals and crap. And there are esoteric magazines and loads of tarot decks. It's a hoot. So go there. And just as I was wandering out after yet another unsuccessful hunt for some rare Kenneth Grant books that didn't cost £200, it struck me that it wasn't always this easy. I'm interested in magic and I'm quite open and public about it, but that's not something that everyone else can really do for various reasons. In fact, as we all know, hundreds of years ago, if you were interested or practicing these types of naughty things, then you were putting your very life in danger. All it would take is for some nosy neighbour to finger you, and I'm sure we've all been fingered by a nosy neighbour at one time or another. I'm sure you get my meaning. I was thinking about the witch trials, which were happening across Europe, America. These witch hunts, both figurative and literal, whenever they happen, there's a pattern to it. It happens when those in charge of societies, or at least those who think they are, pretend to be, they're in danger of losing their grip on power. Now, on the surface, you might think those days are gone and we're way more enlightened now, but just because we're not burning people at the stake anymore doesn't mean there isn't a very real danger. You don't have to look far in the United Kingdom to see who the scapegoats are right now. Muslim people, women especially, surprise, surprise, are bearing the brunt of a storm currently being whipped up by politicians and people in the public eye. People with a voice, which is heard, but instead of using it to better society, they use it to manipulate people's fears so that they get more power. Imagine being that much of a prick. It's a very simple formula. First, you take away people's stuff. You take away their money, their benefits, their jobs, their privacy. You decrease wages but increase taxes. You reduce the size of Mars bars but push the cost up to 89p. That's the fire lit. Then you stoke it, you get people riled up. Fire lit, fire stoked, then you channel that rage and fear in a direction that suits you. You ensure that all the good news is buried on pages 30 to 50 of all the newspapers, and you make sure the first thing that everyone sees is how a person who wasn't white did something shitty to someone else, while ignoring, of course, all the white people in court that day too for doing shitty things. Then, all of a sudden, you have people who've never even touched a Quran in their lives, or even researched what the word hijab actually means, suddenly have an opinion on what women can wear. And no one's looking at the politicians anymore. No one's looking at the stupid decisions that are being made. It doesn't seem right to me if people's main concern is about whether Muslim women are being forced to wear the veil. If that's the main concern, tackle that. Tackle domestic abuse. Tackle the oppression of people. Get a debate going about the crossover of the state and religion and whether or not you think it's right and what can be done about it. And by the way, the only method of finding all this out is by engaging with members of the community and talking to them, opening a dialogue and leaving your judgments at the door just for a moment. There are other ways that witch hunts like this can start as well. One is through guilt. When members of society have an unacknowledged guilt about something, they try and suppress it. But because most people are about as disciplined with their minds as a toddler in a sweet shop, or me in one of those Belle Epoque fancy cake shops, it all starts to seep out. They're not very good at it. The satanic panic days of the 1980s and 90s are a great example. Let's imagine, it's the 1980s in the US. You're a parent, your president, unfortunately, is Ronald Reagan. You've got great hair and you listen to the Bangles a lot, so that's something. Times are good, business booming, it's all about capitalism, productivity, so both you and your husband work full-time jobs, so the kids get left at daycare centres. You add to the mix things like the still looming threat of the Soviet Union. You've got Thatcher on the other side of the water screaming about all sorts of things. A mysterious plague is killing gay people in the United Kingdom. There's stranger danger. Kids' faces stuck on milk cartons. Jerry Falwell and his evangelical mutants shouting about computer games and video nasties. All these distractions. And so all the while, deep down, parents realise that they've absconded from their duties as parents in order to earn more money to keep up. They notice that their little kid is behaving a bit strangely. So what happens? Do they take a look at themselves and say, oh, shit, look at that. I'm a crap parent and I should probably spend more time with my kids. Of course not. They couldn't possibly admit to being human and making a mistake. They imagine that it must be these monstrous satanic cults or these menacing, predatory devil worshippers using their children in dark rituals and conducting horrifying sacrifices. It's much more convenient to demonize something. It's way easier to blame a monster than to look at your own shortcomings. And if there aren't any monsters, you can just invent them. Let's go back to the 21st century, where there's Wi-Fi and Jerry Falwell is long dead. Hooray! We live in weird times. Unpredictable, you might say. And there were days when I was growing up that I didn't get any help or support as a gay man. Some teachers weren't even allowed to give me the support that I needed, even though they really wanted to. Things in that respect are much easier, personally, though I'll be the first to say that we still have a long way to go. As a practitioner of magic, I personally have it pretty easy too. Though I'm learning to be a bit more discerning with whom I discuss my activities, so far the worst that happens is just getting a funny look from someone when I say I read tarot cards. If only they knew. But things can change pretty quickly, as any Muslim woman who's had a headscarf ripped off her might tell you. So for this episode of the Hex Files, we celebrate just how kind of safe we are for the moment. And we go way back in time to the 16th and 17th century in Venice. And I'm joined by Dr. Will Visconti, who very graciously spared an evening of his time to come and talk with me about the Venetian Witch Trials. Here it is. The views and opinions expressed on the Hex Files are not necessarily ones that I share. However, in the interests of non-censorship and transparency, the Hex Files brings you unedited interviews and conversation with guests of a magical, queer, feminist background. As such, the following episode may contain contentious and adult themes, so beware. Welcome to the Hex Files, in association with Sentient Sanctuary. I'm your host, Dana Fox. So, Dr. Visconti, thank you very much for joining me on the Hex Files.
Thank you for inviting me. It's delightful to be here.
You're welcome. We're sat currently in, I'm going to call it my study/conservatory ramshackle of a sort of backyard veranda, just to evoke a description for the listeners. I think it's currently been somewhere in the range of 34, 35 degrees, which for me, living in the British Isles, has been extraordinary. For you, as an Antipodean,
Coming from the colonies, not so remarkable.
No.
But I'm not complaining. After having dealt with a rather long winter, as long as I'm not on the bus for too long, I'm fine.
No, that goes all year round. We did have an array of things that there were options to speak about. I first met you. Well, I didn't meet you. I was a voice at the back.
Yes, you were a question.
I was a question at your lecture at Treadwell's about Marquesha Louisa Casati, one of my favourite people, and I couldn't believe that there was a lecture specifically on her. I thought, well, this won't be very well attended. There'll be 3 people and me. It was sold out, and it was a bloody good lecture.
Which was all a surprise to me. I really did not anticipate that any of the lectures that I have given at Treadwell's would be met with that sort of a response and that enthused response, which is fantastic, of course. But yeah, I really wasn't sure if it was something that's quite niche, or is it going to be a very specific sort of person who comes along? Because often, especially with someone like Louisa, it will be witchy people, or it will be fashion people, or it will be witchy fashion people. There are sort of niches where she has very much been taken on. I mean, there are all sort of the perennial articles where she's talked about as sort of the godmother of goth and that sort of thing. So, you know, there's a whole other goth scene, fetish, whatever it is, Italian studies sometimes. Yeah, it was remarkable to be able to speak to so many people who knew what I was on about, and it wasn't just them kind of wandered in out of pure curiosity. There was a certain level of assumed knowledge, which I've certainly not seen with Louisa before. Much more people know her here. And also because I know a lot of people in cabaret and burlesque and stuff, and so it's, again, niche.
Yes.
But so, yes, that was marvellous.
10 small niches make a full room and a sold-out lecture, apparently.
Apparently.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you know, I had my own little surprise when I first went to see her grave after trying to find it, and to just thinking that I would be the only little lowly person coming to burn a little bit of frankincense, to find that it was decorated with beads and necklaces and a picture frame, the copy of the Man Ray.
Yeah, one of the photo portraits. I mean, that was actually something that I found a little bit funny when I went to Brompton, and of course I found it was an Australian in the office, and he was listening to an Australian radio station when I went in there, and I asked him, because I couldn't find her grave, I asked him whereabouts she was, and he said, "Oh, we haven't had anyone come visit her for a while." So I was like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And I had interviewed an Italian artist / fashion designer who was telling me about how she had visited. She's an alumna of Central St Martin's, Claudia Scarcella. She's done some stuff about Louisa, and her graduate collection was inspired by Louisa and some of the guises that she had adopted, and the masquerade balls that she had held in Venice. But so anyway, you know, I discussed it with Claudia a little bit, and then I found out, okay, so this is where I need to go. She hasn't had any visitors for a while, but there were actually still offerings, still gifts. So people had left peacock feathers and black feathers and fake pearls and hagstones and all sorts of things. But I was also very fortunate because that particular that time of year, it had all been the grass had been cut, there had actually been some maintenance done, it had been maintained a bit better, whereas usually in that part of the cemetery apparently it's a conservation initiative, so she would have been completely swallowed up by the long grass. So I was very fortunate to get there at just the right time of the year to
the grave is about
the
gravestone is about the size of a pineapple, so.
And that's the thing, yeah, it would, if the grass gets too long, then I knew sort of what to expect. I had seen photos, but even then, the sense of scale, it's quite unassuming, especially because you've got sort of headstone, little gap where there's Louisa's thing, headstone, and you know, especially kind of considering how larger than life she was, it's a bit funny.
It's a comical turn.
Yeah, and yet it is very appropriate that they don't have her age listed. She wouldn't have wanted that, especially because the graveyard records actually list her as older than she was, so she would have hated that.
Okay, that's perfect. Poor woman. We'll probably end up coming back to her at a later date.
She's great fun. She's worth revisiting.
Oh yes. But you did you said something about the Venetian Witch Trials, which piqued my interest. So I'd like to call it research, but I actually didn't. I did some cooking while I listened to your lecture at Canterbury Christchurch University, which was I think was it a year or two ago now?
That was last December.
Okay.
So December 2017, yeah.
I thought it was great because, like, as a practicing witch with someone, as someone who kind of like thinks they know what the witch trials were about and what happened and how blanket awful they were and bloody and gruesome, I was very surprised that in Venice it was very different in the 16th and 17th centuries. What didn't happen, and what happened?
There are a couple of distinctions to be made in terms of what didn't happen. So within Venice itself, metropolitan Venice, and sort of what would have counted as Venice proper rather than just kind of in the Veneto region more broadly or anything like that. Within Venice, there were no executions for witchcraft. They also didn't necessarily, there weren't all that many burnings. It was to the extent that one courtesan who was accused of witchcraft, called Adriana Savorgnan, was the daughter probably of a courtesan or a concubine. Laura was Adriana's mother, and so Adriana had made a very advantageous marriage to the son of one of the most powerful families in the city, and so they had accused Adriana of witchcraft because she obviously couldn't possibly have snagged a wealthy husband and so on legitimately. But when they were trying to date how old Adriana was and how long she had been working and so on, Laura said, "Oh, I remember the year that I gave birth to my daughter was the year that I arrived in Venice. It was the year that they burned the priest." So that was a big enough event in the calendar, and it was a priest, notice, rather than, just a common or garden heretic or a sodomite or a witch or anything like that. And this particular priest, whose name unfortunately escapes me, I could rifle through my notes, but I won't sort of have that as the background noise of the recording, but he was connected to the Convertite, which was a religious institution basically for women who wanted to be nuns instead of sex workers. And so there was this whole idea of converting and repenting of your past life. But he had been having sex with a group of the women theoretically in his care, and he had been pimping a group of the others.
Okay.
And so then all of this dodgy business that he had been up to, and so he was burned publicly. But in terms of witchcraft executions in Venice, there were none. There were burnings within the Veneto, there were burnings elsewhere in Italy, and in that regard it's also much more in keeping with the patterns that we see in, say, France and Germany, or Scotland, when they weren't putting their witches into barrels and rolling them down hills and so on. But in this is also the thing that the common misconception. Everyone assumes witches were burned, so they say, "Oh, so and so was burned in Salem or burned in England." No, England and North America did not burn accused witches; they hanged them. Yes. Italy, different situation, and then Venice, another situation again. Not at all. And even in terms of imprisonment, women were, if they were wealthy enough, these courtesans particularly that I've focused on, they could. Not unlike the system now, if you knew someone who knew someone and you had money, they could buy their way into a suspended sentence or whatever. Then there was sometimes more like...
Are you implying that happens now, in these enlightened times?
I don't know if I want to answer that question since I'm being recorded. It could potentially... I sound like Joan Rivers. Allegedly. It could allegedly happen. But yes, there were often sort of other ways and means, and so things like kind of public penance, public humiliation, if you like, sort of having to stand outside one's own church with a sign saying, "I've committed an act of heresy," or basically paying fines. They'd donate to a charitable cause, and then they wouldn't need to worry about imprisonment or necessarily, perhaps banishment was also quite a severe punishment within the Venetian Republic. Certainly not.
There was more of a focus on re-education rather than punitive measures.
Yeah, and I think...
Well, the motivation for that sounds very enlightened and very forward-thinking from the outset, was it?
It's deceptive, I think, because the other thing that one needs to bear in mind is it's not necessarily, it would be lovely to be able to talk about some enlightenment in, sort of La Lumière and all of the stuff that came a little bit later, and the more sort of rational, sceptical tradition of looking at magic. But it was also, this is sort of against the backdrop of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So, in an age where to call someone Lutheran was an insult, there was a lot of emphasis, a lot of interest in uniformity of doctrine and making sure that everyone kind of towed the line in a religious sense, because they didn't want to have all of these funny, heretical, questionable sects with their weird ideas kind of complicating matters. Plus there is also the concern that was ongoing for quite a few centuries of stamping out superstition, and this is the other thing that people sometimes would say, there was a blurring of folk magic or superstition or kind of religious, you could perhaps call it prayer for lack of a better term, the praying to a saint, praying through the intercession of a saint for a given outcome, and being a regular churchgoer and so on. But at the same time, people would also cast little spells, or they would try to compel the spirits of the dead to do things for them, or I want to say doing a deal with the devil, which makes it sound a lot more dramatic than they would have seen it, certainly, but that was just what you did at the time. And again, this is something that is not uncommon in that period. If you look in Ireland, the sort of murkiness around the fairy folk and that type of thing. In North America, people talk about the Puritans and how they were very thou shalt not, and all of the dramas with Salem. Well, at the same time, in places like Salem and the townships around Massachusetts, where there were issues and where there were persecutions, people would engage in fortune telling. People would bake witch cakes. There was a lot of that kind of popular folk remedy, folk magic sort of practice that went on, and in this period, in so many different contexts, at a certain level, and there's also this, I think, class coming into it, people not really seeing it as a sin or as something you shouldn't do, but they kind of have no choice, that it was just an extra thing that was part of one's arsenal, if you like, and there was also, hand in hand with enforcing religious doctrine, the rise of men muscling in on medical practice, and so that not necessarily in terms of science and medicine, but poo-pooing and suppressing women in medicine, so midwives, and women who were folk healers. And that opens up a whole other can of worms, because you've got things like practical magic and prayer and superstition at the same time as there is the use of herbs. There is something like oil that has been blessed. Well, maybe it's not necessarily that it's been blessed, but it's that type of oil that's so all of these kind of nuances that come into play at that time, and certainly have a bearing on the persecutions and to an extent the outcomes as well, with people just sort of saying, oh well, that's just wrong, not necessarily, oh it's evil, just
that's not the way you do it here,
that's not the done thing, precisely, or it's a little bit wrong, it's a little bit misguided, it's a little bit foolish.
The nuances in language were important, because I do remember from your lecture it was a case of there was a somewhat more excusable defence if you said, if a woman accused of witchcraft said, I asked the devil to do it and he bloody did it. That was slightly more reasonable, or at least not quite as bad as sort of saying I made a deal with the devil or the devil possessed me. It was all about that subservience was seen to be the amoral thing. Am I correct? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the cases where this really comes up is a courtesan called Isabella Bellocchio, who was talking about, also there is very much the idea of the each way bet, basically, because she did not see the dialectic in what she was doing. She went to church and prayed and did all of the, in inverted commas, the right things, made all the right noises and all of that. At the same time, she was calling a little bit of extra help, and she was compelling the devil to do things. Now the way that she said it is she positioned herself as commanding the devil, and certainly this idea of obeisance to the devil was very problematic at that time. Because there was the idea of let's see if I can remember how to phrase this. It's not acknowledging anything that is greater than God's power, but also it's kind of working within, say, the devil's remit. So if it is the devil's power to tempt, and someone wants to lure a client from a rival, or wants to snag a husband but he might already be spoken for, or something like that, okay, you tell the devil, or you make the devil tempt this person to come to you. So
it might not be the best thing to do, but it reinforces the dogma and the doctrine that was important for those in power at the time.
It's playing by their rules.
Yes.
Yeah, it's still kind of acknowledging that they are acknowledging that they're acknowledging that the devil does have power, but not greater power than God.
Yeah.
And God is still the prime being in this instance, but it's also this idea of, well, you ask both sides just in case. And there were also cases of people doing the same with the spirits of the dead, or the spirits of executed criminals in particular, which was, again, seen as, I suppose you could say, incorrect religious practice. It wasn't the done thing. But again, there's this idea of compulsion and also kind of doing it is not bargaining so much as say, okay, you do this thing for me, and sometimes also little practices like throwing salt into the fire, because there was a belief of sort of half demons and things. That sometimes was a little bit of a problematic issue, because then it's like, well, is this obeisance? Is this to placate them? What is the reasoning behind it? Are you acknowledging them as having greater or lesser power? But yeah,
would it be fair to say that the Inquisition in forms throughout the globe at this time, in America, in Scotland, in England, in Germany, were not quite so, I don't want to say lenient, because they didn't sound particularly lenient, but were they quite so concerned with the facets and nuances as they were in Venice? And if not, what was different and why?
Outside of Venice, I don't want to be making sweeping generalizations, because I think there are so many variations that can be brought in, but I think it's interesting to point out that, so there's kind of the Spanish Inquisition, or the fuller term escapes me, something about the doctrine of the faith.
The Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah.
And so Venice had its own bodies set up, plus they sometimes kind of liaised, if you like, with Rome. But I think part of it is also Venice's relationship to Rome was already fractious, because the city as a whole was excommunicated twice.
Right.
And part of me, this is potentially rather facile, but part of me often does sort of think in terms of, well, Venetians were never going to be told what to do by Rome. I mean, really, remember that they had their republic. They had at this stage, politically it was a different beast. Religiously, it was a bit of a different situation, and I think they were basically more concerned with losing people to doing the wrong thing and losing people to sort of to Lutheranism or to the wrong denomination or the wrong way, rather than any of the sort of conspiracies that you come across in North America or in Britain with, you know, the North, or looking at the North Berwick witches in Scotland, or what was going on in Essex, or any of that, where there's this sort of conspiracy theory, and Venice doesn't have that, and to the extent that also a lot of the testimony, the diabolical elements and things aren't there when they do come in. It's after that sort of stuff had become common knowledge that was what people were talking about elsewhere, and it was dismissed. People were just, oh, you're just making that up. You know, the Malleus Maleficarum wasn't taken especially seriously. There was a friar who was on trial because of a witchcraft case, and that was because of sort of misappropriation of sacred items, holy items, and using the host in a spell. Was it consecrated or was it not? Because that makes a big difference in this sort of sense. Or cases like the affair of the poisons in France, which had a political element to it as well, but also within a lot of these cases there's the element of diabolism, which is absent in Venetian persecution. So that whole idea of signing your name in the devil's book and kissing his ass and so on, the witches' sabbats and, you know, grinding our babies for flying on it and all that sort of, those much more, the lurid elements are just not there. And I think part of it is there was a degree of scepticism, and this might also feed in, again, like I was saying, the idea of sort of defending the Republic, because they had a system in place for that. So, you know, if there were denunciations or accusations of treason, they were actually very rigorous with that. And so it sort of stands to reason that they would be equally rigorous in applying the same sort of, you know, there needed to be the body of proof that someone was a witch who was, you know, doing something that they shouldn't.
Because that was a thing as well. You couldn't just accuse somebody of it if you had nothing to back it up.
Yes, you had to prove that you had to prove that they would ask explicitly. They asked, I think, the accusers, but definitely accused witches, do you know anyone who might bear you a grudge? Because we see in so many witch trials, there's this, there's a whole sort of, what's the Shakespeare quote? You know, ancient grudges with civil blood makes civil hands unclean, something along those. But you know, this whole idea, sort of ongoing sagas across generations, or, you know, rivalries and so on. Pendle Hill being a case in point in Britain. We've got families who are against one another, individuals who are against one another. In Venice, they tried to avoid that, so they did actually look into whether or not someone is just accusing their neighbour as a convenient way to get them, you know, imprisoned or whatever. So they did approach it quite systematically and in a very different way to other countries where, you know, there was spectral evidence or children's testimony or whatever being used.
There was this focus as well, instead of it being a very damning, terrible thing to be accused of or rumoured to be a witch, there was actually satire made about people who were kind of accused of witchcraft, and it was often caricatures, am I right, were presented.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of elements to that. So there are the women that I have looked at in particular are figures like Tullia d'Aragona and her mother Giulia Ferrarese, who were both courtesans. And Tullia was very much at the pinnacle of success as a courtesan, to the extent that she was able to sort of pull strings with the Medici and avoid sumptuary laws and that sort of thing, because she, and as what was referred to at the time as the cortigiana onesta, so it sort of means, literally onesta means honest, but in this context it's honourable. The cortigiana onesta was a figure who could play instruments and speak multiple languages and cover screens, and I know not what. They were very accomplished women, and so Tullia was one of these figures who, some of them were published poets and philosophers, and they had salons and so on, and Tullia was one such, and there were these sort of scurrilous pieces composed about her saying that, well, she must be a witch because that's how she's able to drum up business, and she and her mother are these crones who were using magic to drum up custom because they're a pack of clapped out old whores. And it's this very sort of sexist, violent, sexually violent language, but also it was not taken as a serious accusation of witchcraft. Just she would have seen it and either kind of dismissed it as him, or it's sort of slanderous, but it's not anything that would be cause for concern. Conversely, in other places, even if people were to joke about someone being a witch, then there would probably be a mob forming.
This is more equivalent of ending up in Punch magazine, perhaps.
Yeah, it's this kind of...
It's some journalists taking the piss and taking pot shots.
Yeah, it's sort of mean doggerel, but it's not anything that would also necessarily result in permanent reputation damage.
Right.
And certainly some of these women returned fire. They clapped back. Veronica Franco was a Venetian courtesan who counted Henri III of France among her clients at one point, and then she sent him some sort of laudatory poems afterwards, because she was a poet as well. And when she was, for lack of a better term, this is a technical term, slagged off through verse, she returned fire, and she would defend herself and kind of paint herself as an Amazon queen leading her warriors against the insults of these male poets and sort of the violence done against women by men. And
because Veronica Franco was a witty, verbose, well-read feminist, possibly.
Yeah, she's been reclaimed by feminist scholarship since maybe the 60s, 70s, and that was also around the time when there began to be a re-evaluation of the figure of the witch in relation to feminism, the figure of the sex worker in relation to feminism. Yeah. Some of those debates are still ongoing and problematic. I mean, you just need to look at things like discussions about the Nordic model to see that it's in some some cases. We still haven't quite moved on from the 60s or before, but that's beside the point. Veronica was an advocate of education for women, sort of provision of more options for women. She actually did not suggest that anyone pursue sex work, becoming a courtesan, as a career. So there are a lot of letters that have survived and been published of hers, and a mother wrote to her saying, should my daughter become a courtesan? She sends this very impassioned, well-reasoned piece which says, no, don't let your daughter become a courtesan, that's a terrible choice. She had an education above and beyond what a lot of women received in Italy, in Venice, in Europe, I suppose, at that time. But then I should also point out that the literacy rate in the 16th, 17th centuries in Venice among women was maybe 10 to 12%, which is decent for that time. But then that was also often a practical thing. It's this idea of everybody works in the family business and someone needs to be able to do the sums, and so the wife or the daughter or whatever is helping to do the admin at the back of the shop type of situation. Veronica as feminist, I think, is a very interesting proposition, because I would love to absolutely jump on that bandwagon. I think we need to be careful. It's a little bit like when people talk about queerness, actually, and Radcliffe Hall perhaps is an example. People saying, "Oh, Radcliffe was trans." Well, was she though? What was Radcliffe actually trans though? We don't know enough about their experience, and also because of the framing at the time, or the same as the problematic politics of someone like Anne Lister, who didn't believe in votes for women, but she was also very openly lesbian, or what we would define now as lesbian. And this is also the thing, like using a word like queer or feminist or whatever, and working backwards is a bit tricky. But Veronica was certainly ahead of her time in terms of pushing for choice, basically, but also not being afraid to defend herself, which it also sometimes did entail playing the weak and feeble woman card.
Well, that was
using it to her advantage.
The defences that they came up with in court certainly wouldn't fall under the regis of feminism, when the kind of defences that they needed to come up with to get themselves off would be like, I'm just a girl, how could I possibly read this grimoire, it's all icky.
This is the thing, that sometimes they would pretend that they were illiterate.
When it suited them.
Yeah, they could play dumb because it was feasible for a woman to be able to say, until you dig a little bit deeper, so excuse me, there was a woman called Laura Malipiero who was brought before the Inquisition in Venice several times, accused of witchcraft and selling love potions and all sorts of things. And at one point she was found to have suspicious books in her possession. Now remember that this is sort of when the printing, Aldo Manuzio had the printing press in Venice, but also Venice as a trade hub. There would have been so much knowledge exchange going on through the city at that time, and so she made the defense of, is that forbidden material? I didn't know. I was given that sort of in trust because I had a lodger and he gave the books to me, and I didn't know what they were, but I knew that they were worth money. So that's
we get so many books coming through this place.
It's kind of that was payment of, he left that in his room when he left, when he had moved or whatever. But look, beyond that, she had to be registered with certain guilds because of the nature of what she was doing, because she also had multiple sidelines, multiple streams of income. She had to be able to do the admin because she had lodges and so on. So she kind of wasn't able to play as dumb as certain others. There was a courtesan called Cassandra. Fantastic. If you're going to talk about courtesans accused of witchcraft, you want to talk about women accused of witchcraft, someone called Cassandra is the perfect example, because she was accused of writing, there was spells and sort of forbidden written material, and some of it was in her hand, and she was able to just say, no, I'm a poet. I've been composing poetry, and those things that look like spells are really just handwriting exercises.
Very clever.
And and Veronica, when she was accused of performing necromancy, she said, "Oh goodness, no! I'm the most timid woman in the world when it comes to death." Never mind that she got up and mounted her own defence and spoke on her own behalf. But again, from time to time, it was not unusual for women to, because that was basically one of the very few things that they could probably use in their defence, was to say, was kind of to be, if you like, just a girl. Now, in several cases, it probably indicates that they were fairly shrewd in doing that. Because also sometimes they also were very open about what they did because they didn't see it as evil, or they got exasperated. There was one woman who was accused of witchcraft, and she literally sort of sighs in the transcript, said, "Oh God, every time someone gets a little bit sick, they come running accusing us old women of being witches." She was kind of grumbling and saying, "Oh, this is just getting ridiculous." But all of these different elements were going on at the same time, so you can also sometimes see the limited agency that women could wrest from the situation.
While all this was going on, was there like an eventual? You talked about the Reformation, but what actually happened to all this? Did this carry on? Did any of these so-called apparent witches continue doing their plying their trade, doing their thing? Did it come to a head? Was there an eventual culmination where everyone just got very much fed up of all of this witchcraftery and decided to put a stop to it? Or
I suspect it just had kind of petered out, which is not...
History's never as explosive as the films, is it?
No, sometimes it kind of sort of a little bit is. I think one of the definitive cases was the affair of the poisons in France, but that was because it went right to Louis XIV, and because the Sun King was involved, and because some of his mistresses were implicated, he actually sort of stepped in and went, "Okay, no, this has gotten silly," and he actually changed tack and said, "It's snake oil selling. It's not heresy, it's nonsense." And so that was a very definitive kind of turning point into, where persecutions were concerned. But in Venice, it was a little bit different, it just sort of fizzled. But where individual cases are concerned, some of them kind of struggled all their lives and they never quite, you're not going to hear of this one becoming a rich witch. Some of them, Andriana must have married and done all right for herself, because she and her husband eloped, and after a certain period, the authorities gave up chasing them. There are no records of any dramas. Laura Malipiero died an old woman in her own bed with assets. Some of them, Isabella Bellocchio received 3 marriage proposals while she was in prison, so her spells must have been working. And she paid a fine or whatever and sort of left. So there were some happy endings, but not necessarily anything explosive.
So while all these courtesans and Venetian prostitutes and witches were doing their thing, we haven't actually spoke about what their thing was with regards to their practice, folklore or not, witchcraft or not, devil worship, devil liaisons with demons. What exactly did it entail? Because obviously practices vary from city to city, town to country to country. I'm curious as to what they were actually up to.
There were a lot of different things. There's kind of a spectrum in terms of complexity and subtlety, and how kind of involved some of these processes were, and also that could mean that it was easily explained away. They could sort of hide it. Excuse me. Now, some of it was things like what's called a carta di voler bene, so there would be a sort of spell, prayer, whatever you want to call it, and that's kind of written, and it's a handwritten thing that is kept on one's person, and there's that whole idea, but you put stuff in a pouch and you wear it. A lot of the practices that have been documented are not dissimilar to things that people might use today or have used in the intervening centuries. Some of them used tarot cards. So there are references with Isabella Bellocchio and the likeness of the devil. So she was using the devil card from the tarot, assumedly, and lighting a lamp, at a specific time and in a specific place to the devil, or little practices that people had, like throwing salt into the fire, banging the hearth chair. So there's a practice called dar martello, which is literally to hammer, and that's kind of like the nearest equivalent is maybe something along the lines of sticking pins in the doll type of. It is this compelling of someone to do stuff. So one way of hammering a lover would be to strike the hearth stones or whatever, strike the fireplace with the hearth chain. And so it's, as I strike this wall, as I hammer this wall, your heart will beat for me and me alone, that type of thing. Or use of that same chain for divination, and so the way that it falls indicates that different links in the chain indicate people, and so they're gauging the distance, how close are you, or buttafare, which is beam throwing as a divination tool, or for love spells, divination using oil and holy water, and some of it was effectively scrying, and some of these were also a bit more complicated because you needed a child who was pure and so on, who could look into the vessel, look into the water, and see the truth of what. So if you're trying to find Veronica Franco, for instance, apparently this was done under her roof without. She said, I had nothing to do with it. I did that when I was a child once, and it didn't work. It's a load of rubbish. But to retrieve lost or stolen objects, the child needs to look into the bowl and they will see whoever the culprit was. There was the use of holy oil. So again, because it's blessed, because it's sacred, it's got that power. And to smear holy oil on one's lips means that whoever you kiss, they will be yours. And actually, it's completely up to you to take that on or put it off. It can be ended. It's not a sort of spell where it's very hard to shake someone once you've once they've outlived their usefulness, or whenever your ardour cools. Use of different herbs, writing religious phrasing on herbs, and then cooking them in something that you serve to your lover. Use of menstrual blood or semen, menstrual blood in wine that is given to a lover. Combining specific herbs plus menstrual blood plus the host in wine that you give to your lover. That was what was it? Paolina di Rossi was another sex worker who had the connivance of a priest friend who it turns out was in love with her, and she was in love with someone else, and so she was trying to get him to get this guy to marry her, and so she combined all of these different elements together, and then there are also sort of potions and filters and things, and there's often a link between women who are sex workers and women who are selling love potions. There's this sort of multitasking to supplement one's income, and there are also things like walking through the city, and you need a child or whatever, and there are actions of because it's to do with the route taken by criminals about to be executed, and you pretend to cut off the hand, cut off the foot, cut off the head, and it's all sort of, again, compelling spirits and so on.
There's something of a fascination with to-be or recently executed criminals. They had a particular emphasis on the power of that, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, it always puts me in mind of something like The Hand of Glory.
Yes.
But I think it's also this, it comes back to this doing a deal. So they would say, you get this lover for me, you achieve this thing for me, and I'll say prayers for you. So it's, I will say 3 Hail Marys for the wickedest soul in hell if he gets me who or what I want. So again, dealing and bargaining in a way, but then it's also probably it can be argued, well, no, I'm saying prayers, and it's forgiveness, and so there are ways and means around it. But again, it's use of prayer, but it's also use of the not so strictly orthodox Christian practice, and often these. The other thing to point out, I would actually have kicked myself if I had forgotten to mention this, is quite why they're casting these spells. It's money, it's love, it's sex, it's finding treasure. None of this kind of, I want my cattle to give good milk, I want the crops to prosper. This is a city we're talking about, so it's a very different, it's sex and it's profit.
What people would call results-based low magic. I would never employ low magic as a term because of what I personally think, but it's there's not a lot of coming together in covens.
Yeah, they don't do covens, they don't do organised. Sometimes there were networks of sort of sharing information, sharing tips and so on, but they didn't work together as a coordinated force. They didn't have the same goals in mind as a lot of people in other, if you look at more famous either Anglophone or elsewhere on the European continent, witchcraft trials and persecutions, it's not that. Women want to find a lover, keep a lover, bind a lover, get a husband, make an advantageous marriage. They want to find treasure. There's often people looking for buried treasure. They want to retrieve a stolen item. They want to, do well for themselves. It's not. You
can learn a lot about the society that you're looking at if you look at the archaeology and the folklore around it, and so it explains a hell of a lot about what it might have been like to live in Venice at this period. You have to just look at the folklore of what people were interested in.
Absolutely, and it was a wealthy city. It was a trade hub. It was a cultural centre, and so it's kind of not remarkable that there's so much focus on success in business, and I mean, I'm not even sure that I've necessarily seen, they want their husband to come back from sea in one piece or anything like that. It's business. I want the business to do well. I want the marriage to be prosperous. It's this type of stuff that people really seemed to, or this is certainly one of the big patterns in the research that I've conducted. That's what was motivating people a lot more in this period and in this city in particular.
Well, I'm certainly going to delve a little bit further into reading about this. If you have any suggested reading, I'd be happy to.
I can give you a list.
I suspected as much. So, all this came about because I really wanted to start delving into subject matter that I knew very little about, and I tell you what, you've given me a hell of a lot to think about. I wanted to say thank you for appearing on the Hex Files, and I hope in future that we can talk. We're gagging to talk about Louisa Cassati. I know we are, and we both know that we could drag on.
That could be a series in and of itself. We just have a different Louisa thing for every week. Yeah.
Well, we have a vague itinerary in front of us, certainly in front of me, because I don't feel happy unless I've got a clipboard in my hand and I can wave it around, even if it's got nothing on it apart from a biro. But I guarantee if we start talking about Louisa Cassati for any length of time, we won't need notes at all.
No.
We'll just need a microphone, a bottle of wine, and an open door.
Yep.
Maybe next time.
That's the plan for the next one.
So thanks very much. Do you have any closing remarks, sir?
No, I think it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. But I will cease my wittering, and all I'll say is I am on Twitter if anybody is inclined to follow me. I have a few things in the pipeline at present, so this way I will be updating the projects that I'm working on. I'm also on, if anybody is on academia.edu, I'm there. My Twitter handle is @Will Visconti. I've got a forthcoming publication. It will be taking a little while, but it will be there eventually, which is actually about representation of courtesans in contemporary historical fiction. But, closer to when I know what the publication date is for that, and for some Louisa-related projects and other bits and pieces, it will be a case of follow me on Twitter, more news as it breaks.
Dr. Will Visconti, thank you very much.
You're listening to the Hex Files in association with Sentient Sanctuary. Witchcraft and magic, religion and spirituality, the paranormal, LGBT and queer issues, and alternative culture.